I'm Allison Jonjak, the Cranberry Outreach Specialist with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. These videos are the on-demand recordings of UW Extension and the Wisconsin State Cranberry Growers Association's virtual brown bag lunch series. These monthly sessions offer growers and researchers a way to share timely and relevant information. We hope you'll enjoy and continue to engage with us.
Hi, I'm Tom Lochner, the Executive Director of the Wisconsin State Cranberry Growers Association. We're excited to be a partner with Extension to bring you research-backed resources, tools, and tips to keep Wisconsin marshes productive and profitable.
Thank you. The little bit of housekeeping that we go through. Welcome to the June edition of our virtual Cranberry Brown Bag. We're going to get to go through a little bit of time-sensitive and on-the-spot information, both from researchers as well as from some of our product suppliers, research and scientists in the field. You have closed captions down on the screen below you, and if you're not seeing those, you should be able to hit the little ... ellipsis to say show more and show captions. I think that that's it for the housekeeping, apart from have yourself on mute unless you want to ask a question. We do encourage people to ask questions throughout, and you can either use the chat if you want to ask a question publicly, or you can chat and use the little drop down to Allison Jonjak, and then I will ask your question on your behalf anonymously. The other thing you can do is unmute yourself and ask directly. And I think with that, usually I would hand the controls over to Tom for a minute. Tom Lochner of the Wisconsin State Cranberry Growers Association. He is on the road serving growers today, and as you can kind of see, we're all kind of on the road today. But Tom wanted to thank people who made it to the golf outing fundraiser that was on Wednesday. And along with that, I think we'll hand it back over to taking off my pretend to be Tom Lochner hat and back on my Cranberry Outreach Specialist with the University of Wisconsin hat. We've got a good lineup today. Dave Jones, the Senior Agricultural Scientist at Ocean Spray at the Babcock Station, is going to be giving us some in-season observations. Then Christelle Godot, whose E apparently accidentally turned into an Polish E instead of a French E. I apologize for that, Christelle. But still, Christelle Godot and Olivia Lake will be talking about, from Christelle's behalf, the current nematode research project that's going on, and then from Olivia, information on the nematodes that are available from Copert. And then in between those two, I'm going to have a quick review of new information in the chemistry world as we're having product availability, new updates. So I will hand it over to Dave unless we have any questions from the audience at this point, and then just a reminder to go ahead and ask questions all along and as we go.
Well, hi, everyone. As always, great to be here. Allison, thanks for the invite, as always. I'm going to be running through a few of the observations, just kind of representing some of the larger trends I've seen statewide in my own travels, particularly things that growers have been asking about particularly commonly, or things that I have been asked to come look at, as well as just some general comments on the weather that we've been having, and a couple of other odds and ends about pre-bloom insect control. So starting with some statewide trends in weather, since we last had a brown bag in May. First thing everyone's aware of at this point, it is really dry out there. We are lagging behind statewide in rain. Now, this is kind of interesting because it's not that we haven't had any rainy days, it's that we haven't had those widespread soaking rains that really catch us up on rain as an area. We have had pop-up showers throughout the month of May and into June, but we haven't really had the kind of rain that will really wet down the substrate and kind of get us reset, if you will. And so you can really see it in the grass, the lawns, the sides of the roads. The interesting impact that this has had on cranberries is that we've been getting unseasonable calls about drought stress. We'll talk about that in a little bit, some of the most common causes for this that we've seen. The other thing to make note of, since the last brown bag, we did have a little bit of frost injury, particularly in central Wisconsin. In terms of when it happened, likely the window of May 23rd to 25th. This was a tough span. We suspect this was more often than not the window where this happened, just based on when the damage showed up, as well as dew point temperature observations for that night. That span was characterized by some pretty low dew points and higher wind. So as a lot of people listening today are aware, the temperature will fall very quickly up until you hit the dew point. After you hit the dew point, the temperature will typically level off a little bit before a second drop later, but you basically have a little bit more leeway once you get down to the dew point because the rate of temperature fall slows. The trick is on a night with incredibly low dew point or where the dew point is significantly below critical temperatures for cranberry, you can get a situation where the dew point is low enough that the temperature falls fast enough that the auto start temperature on a marsh may not be quite high enough to get the vines wetted down prior to when those vines hit that critical temperature. As most folks are aware, it's the formation of ice from water that releases that latent heat of fusion that keeps our vines at a consistent, steady 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So if that ice dries out, or if the vines themselves are not wet when that temperature is reached, the vines experience the ambient temperature rather than, that roughly 32 degrees Fahrenheit that you're going to get when they are being, coated in continuously freezing ice. And so this is why on a low dew point night, you can get frost that's actually even directly beneath a sprinkler. This is always something that frustrates growers because it's one thing to see it on an edge, but when you have it right underneath the sprinkler, it's particularly infuriating. But typically when this happens, not always, but typically it has to do with the dew point being low enough that those vines hit critical temperature prior to being sufficiently wetted with water, which often has to do with startup temperatures. Wind also definitely played a factor here. So again, because coverage is everything on those cold nights, getting the vines wet prior to those critical temperatures being hit. Stiff breeze on the night of a good night of frost watch, we have definitely seen some edges that got hit pretty good during that span. So we're certainly seeing wedges, pie shapes here and there. I will say that overall, this trend is more often just, it's patchy, like we so often see with frost. It's not like whole beds got wiped out for the most part. It's just little patches here and there. There are larger sections on beds, but overall, I think most growers have a spot here, a spot there, but few have anything catastrophic. It's little kind of that annual struggle with frost, but widespread enough to make note of for sure. On a more positive note, one trend that we've seen this year is high upright density. So this is kind of a logical continuation of the side shooting that we had statewide last year. Of course, due to the hail and other potential factors, we had a lot of vegetative side shooting last year. A lot of those terminal buds that we had just never broke. And so instead we got 2, 3, or more vegetative side shoots breaking from those axillary bud positions. The outcome of that is that this year, many older beds in particular look to have a better upright density than we have seen a few years. And generally speaking, our crop forecasting data backs us up as well. We are seeing higher upright density statewide this year than we have seen in recent years overall, which is good news. Upright density is certainly correlated with yield. It doesn't hurt, that's for sure. I would say overall, statewide right now, generally optimistic. It's way too early to say much more than the crop looks like it has potential, obviously. It doesn't look bad at all by any means. And generally, as Stevens are starting to come into hook, overall grower sentiment is neutral to optimistic overall. So it certainly looks like we at least have potential to have a decent year this year. Looking at pre-bloom insect trends. So we did have that intense heat wave in late May and early June. This results in what we typically see in this type of scenario, which is a relatively synced up insect activity prior to bloom. Sometimes in a cold year or a kind of a stop-start year where it goes hot, cold before bloom, we can kind of get insects coming out in fits and starts. This year it went from relatively cool to very, very hot for a couple weeks in a row. And the outcome of this was that most of our pre-bloom insects, including spanworm, cutworm, fireworm, sparg, really all got moving in a fairly tight window and they pushed very fast. And from a control standpoint, this is a really good thing because it means that we can time that pre-bloom spray, which in cranberry is typically only once if it's timed correctly. You typically get excellent kill in a situation where you have quick, intense activity and relatively synced up species activity, because all of the key players are out there when you're into the business of making that application. And I would say in general, this is what we saw come to pass. Late May did bring a couple of those frost watch nights. Like I mentioned, the 23rd to 25th range was a challenging window. And that did add a layer of complexity to that annual debate over when the optimal timing was. Most of our pre-bloom insecticides do not have systemic capabilities, with the exception of orthene. And so the worry is always that you do lose some residue during irrigation, natural rainfall, that kind of thing. And so certainly there was a little bit of debate and discussion over when the best time was, as looking at insect activity and also looking at that against frost watch scheduling. But overall, the results that we've seen suggest that growers did a pretty darn good job of getting the material down at the right time. I did want to mention really quick, just given the recent interest in blunt-nosed leafhopper over the last couple of years, this has not been a common pest to find statewide this year. So I would say, the comments I have on this slide are positive. General experience that we're having, kind of looking at, the beginning of year 3 here since we first discovered these things as a group collectively in 2020. Most of the marshes that initially had this pest have been able to maintain control with single application. And the nice thing about it as well is that it's not an additional application to the typical pre-bloom spray. It's just a pre-bloom application of a material that includes blunt-nosed leafhopper in its efficacy span. So this is nice. We haven't typically seen a situation where growers have had to add an extra spray. And we've also seen very strong evidence that a single application of an effective material provides multiple years of control, which is certainly great news for all of us. The marshes that initially detected it have not seen resurgence since the initial applications, again, which kind of backs up this overall observation that when you find them, if you treat them at the right time with the right product, you not only typically see knockdown when treating the nymphs for the remainder of that season, but we typically see little to no rebound in the subsequent 1 to 2 years, perhaps longer, but we'll kind of be keeping an eye on that in the years to come. Generally, the remaining OPs we've seen show very high efficacy, as does this year's favorite product, Fanfare, also highly effective. We've seen good knockdown with this as well. Overall insect control trends this year, we did see a huge uptick in usage of Fanfare or bifenthrin this year. This is no surprise. It's very inexpensive and it has a very broad spectrum of activity. If you get those two things together, you typically are going to see a very high usage rate. Obviously, this material is relatively new to our industry. Fortunately, though, as is so often the case in cranberry, nothing new that we get is ever really new. It's usually a product that other people have had, other industries have had for some time. So we did have a good amount of experience with Fanfare in other industries to suggest that we figured at least initially on at least 10 to 14 days of killing residue. This is one of the most ultraviolet light stable pyrethroids. Generally speaking, the pyrethroid class is known for being somewhat sensitive to degradation from ultraviolet light. However, several of the formulations that have been synthesized have been created specifically to withstand UV light, bifenthrin certainly making that list. And I would say the performance and the longevity of the kill that we see are definitely representative of this. We figured on at least 10 to 14 days. Many marshes that have used this material are pushing out towards close to 3 weeks, where we really have not seen any significant insect pressure since the application. Is this because the residue is still high, or is this because the insects were synced up and thoroughly wiped out? I'm inclined to think it's probably the latter rather than the former, but we did have very uniform insect activity and a very good window for kill with Fanfare. And so it does seem like this material can be relied on for pretty sustained control for pre-bloom pests. And this is something that we saw across marshes, regardless of which caterpillar species was kind of that driver pest. So marshes that were trying to control fireworm saw great results with fireworm. Marshes that were trying to control sparg saw great results with sparg. And it also seems quite toxic to the cutworm spanworm complex as well, which is good news. Overall control has looked pretty good. Again, I think just given the synced up nature of insect activity. I will say on the Fanfare front, I think the biggest risk that we run with a product that is both extremely cheap and extremely effective is overuse. And I think that this is something that is not yet a critical issue because it is so new to us, but I think it's something that's worth starting to kind of prime our brains to think about. Pyrethroids have been available in other industries for a long time. And although they are excellent tools, they are also somewhat notorious in other industries for having been overused and for having pests develop resistance to them. I personally dealt with a couple of separate instances of pyrethroid resistance in very, very closely related pests to ours when I was at Michigan State University. So not to say that this is going to happen, but it just shows that moth pests can certainly develop resistance to pyrethroid insecticides if we overuse and do not rotate these materials. So Although fanfare is cheap, although it is broad spectrum, it is unfortunately not immune to being overused. And it's something that we're going to have to kind of keep in mind going forward in terms of stewardship for this product, because it does seem to be an outstanding tool. It's certainly very economical. We're going to want to preserve this for as long as we possibly can. And rotation is going to be a big part of that. Impacts of the early season heat. I did just want to touch on this quickly because I have had unseasonably early calls for sudden collapse of vines. These are calls that usually come in July more often than not. Typically, the causes when you see these calls come in July are things like bacterial stem gall, vascular injury from winter, or ice crushing, that kind of thing. Typically, it's compromised vascular systems that are unable to keep up with moisture demands during key periods of heat. This year, these calls started coming in about a month early. I think I got my first call about this on May 31st this year, which is over a month sooner than typical. The reason this happened this year so early is because normally vines with an injured vascular system can kind of limp along early in the season because the moisture demands are not quite as high and heat is typically lower. And so it's a bit more forgiving. But typically what happens in July is a tipping point is reached. Basically, the heat is intense, the moisture demand is really high, and the vines are just not able to keep up with that demand. And so you get a very rapid collapse and browning of this year's growth. This year, we certainly saw that happening, but we saw it happening about a month early. So saw my first bacterial stem gall on June 2nd this year, and also diagnosed several instances of just general vascular injury from winter injury or ice crushing. One interesting side note this year on some of the winter injury or the stem gall or vascular damage from ice that we've seen is that there wasn't a lot of frost in the ground this past year when the ice was starting to come off. Normally, growers will put a flood on to melt the ice out of the ground to get that ice out, to get the frost out of the ground, out of that system. But this year, many growers made the decision not to flood to get frost out of the ground because the ground was already pretty thawed. But an interesting side effect of this decision at some properties is that big, thick ice sheet, rather than having water to kind of cushion it as it came down or fractured and broke off and fell to the side, there was not water there to cushion or catch those pieces. And so one interesting trend we've seen in terms of vascular injury, both canker and just, or stem gall, I should say, and general ice crushing, has been lines across where ice sheets fractured and then fell in the absence of any kind of floodwater to cushion that fall. This has particularly been something we've seen where, big thick ice sheets would have fractured along bed edges. So we do have, and I have it circled in blue, you can kind of see there in the picture, you can see kind of a line on the edge of the bed where that ice sheet would have fractured and fallen to the side as it melted. And this is something we've seen mostly just on marshes, as in exclusively on marshes that did not flood to melt frost out of the ground, as is fairly typical. Overall impact from this, I think, is fairly low, but it is something worth mentioning as it has been certainly been a trend statewide. And something that has certainly been discussed kind of an annual conversation. Unfortunately, bacterial stem gall is not treatable with pesticides. The bacterial species that's associated with the formation of these galls cannot get into vines on its own. It needs a wound point. So that's why it's so commonly associated with harvest tracks, driving too fast during harvest, turning around in the bed, the harrow, sheet of ice coming crashing down near a bulkhead where you didn't get good ice formation, that kind of thing. So typically stem gall is associated with areas where the vines experienced physical injuries. And once you see those galls, there are no control measures available. You cannot spray any kind of pesticide in order to get rid of it. Really, the only thing you can do in the instance that you see stem gall on a property, or in fact, a lot of types of vascular injury from winter, is just sanding. The reason sanding is so helpful is that it buries portions of the stem that are out in front of where that vascular injury would have occurred, meaning the vine is able to form new roots, thus restoring the flow of water to the terminal growth points. So typically, if you see a situation where you're looking at a lot of canker, the best thing you can do is make sure you make good ice and slate that bed for sanding this coming year. Typically, when a bed is sanded after a bad bout of bacterial stem gall, you usually see a pretty quick turnaround as the roots grow back ahead of that damage and the flow of water is restored. That's all I've got. I wanted to keep it 10 to 15 minutes to make sure we stay on schedule, but I'm more than happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you, Dave. Happy to take any questions as people fill in there. I think one thing I would add to that in terms of the early season control and particularly of the leafhopper, I think you had only listed conventional chemistries for those who are using the organic product suite. Pyganic has been the one that is most
Yep.
effective against the early season pests. I think that was the only thing I wanted to add from what I saw.
Yeah, great
in your
call
good
out.
information.
I think pyrethroids generally, we have found, to your point, Allison, the pyrethroid class seems very toxic to these nymphs. So it absolutely, given fanfare's efficacy, other pyrethroids, Pyganic also being a pyrethroid, absolutely makes sense. Thanks for adding that.
Yeah, absolutely. We got our leafhopper nymph trial already completed and scored and everything. So things are looking good on that front.
Good deal.
Any questions to come in the chat? I just want to thank our presenters again and wish everyone a productive rest of the Friday afternoon, a productive and pleasant blossom season.
Thank you.